welcome everybody to this third in Cambridgeshire Historic Churches Trust series of online lectures this summer. I'm David Stasiker. I'm one of the trustees of Cambridgeshire Historic Churches Trust. This lecture will be recorded, by the way, and there will then be available on our trust website. Now, for the benefit of those of you who are not members of the trust, the purpose of the trust is, the main purpose is to make loans and grants towards the cost of repairs and improvements like kitchens and lavatories and so on, to make these works to churches in the county, of which there are more than 300. And many of them, especially in rural villages, are looked after by congregations of just a handful of people who meet the cost of looking after the building as well as paying for their clergy. So if you are not a member of the trust already, we'd be delighted if you could join. And anyway, we hope that having enjoyed this evening's proceedings, you, if you aren't a member, you would make a donation to the trust. Either joining the trust or donating, or both for that matter, are available easily on our website. So the other thing that the trust does in normal times is to organise guided tours of churches in the area and conferences. But in COVID times, of course, we've had to move to working online. The upside of that, of course, is that we can reach an audience beyond those who would be able to attend physically in events within Cambridgeshire and immediate area. So that is something to be thankful for. This series of lectures, which was originally put together for a conference to be held in April 2020, it's concentrating on churches, towers and spires, and the things that are to be found in and on those. They are among the most prominent features, visibly and sometimes audibly, as in this evening's subject, of churches, and so they deserve our attention and our understanding. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, perhaps just one or two technical details. Please, if you aren't already muted, could you do that? If you have questions for our speaker, please could you click on chat, which is at the bottom of the screen for most people, and then type it in. On my system, it's at the bottom of the panel on the right of the screen. Yours may possibly be different, but if you type it in and then usually hit enter in order to register that, so that the speaker and everybody else can see it. Right, having dealt with those, so to speak, housekeeping details, tonight we are privileged to have as our speaker Gareth Davies. Gareth is a Cambridge bellringer. He's a postgraduate researcher and a member of the History and Archives Workgroup of the Central Council of Church Bellringers. Perhaps like me, some of you may often have wondered, looking in the base of a church tower, that this board with a notice about some occasion when they have rung so many thousand, is it triple grandsires? Or, well, anyway, I hope that by the end of this evening, all of this will become absolutely clear, even to those of us who are at the present woefully ignorant about it. Gareth, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, David. Let me just share my screen and hope that technology works. David, I think you need to enable me to share my screen. It's disabled at the moment.
Muted as well. Share screen.
Oh, that's it. That's done it. Thank you.
It done it. Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that everybody can see an introductory slide that says changing and explained.
Yep.
I'll take silence, even though everybody's muted, as acceptance. So thank you for inviting me to talk to you. And I apologise that I had to delay this talk by a couple of weeks. It would also have been nice to meet you all face to face. it has one big advantage from your point of view, is that you're spared the risk of me dragging you onto the stage to help with the demonstration. So instead, I'll be showing some short video clips, and I hope that the technology will work to let me do that. So let me begin by setting English change ringing in some kind of bigger context. It's reckoned that the use of bells in connection with European churches spread in all directions from Italy sometime in the 7th or 8th century. They're certainly well established now, and there are many different traditions and ways in which they're rung. So let's start with the carillon. Large numbers of bells that play, typically via a keyboard, and they usually play religious and secular tunes. And this example is at Dordrecht in the Netherlands.
We don't seem to have sound at the moment.
Right. Have we not got any sound?
No.
No.
Right. Okay. Let me just try that again then. Apologies for that. How about now?
Yes.
Excellent. Right. So that's the carillon. In other places, there's a more direct connection between the ringer and the bells. We may have to listen to the carillon again before we get to it, so apologies for that. So there it's using a keyboard. In other places, the ringer is rather more directly in touch with the bells. And here's an example from Portugal.
Hoje em dia, aos 26 anos, toca de acordo com o que pedem as ocasiões e trabalha para impedir que esta arte manual se perca com o tempo.
Now, in both those cases, you can see that the system of ropes and pulleys connect directly to the clapper of the bell, which is pulled against the inside of it. And in England, we have something similar, actually. The Elocume chimes, such as these at Felmingham in Norfolk, where the ropes pull a hammer that hits the outside of the bell. That mechanism was invented by the Reverend Henry Elocume exactly 200 years ago this year, and first installed at his parish church of Bitton in Gloucestershire. It's usually said that his invention was designed to free him from dependence on the rather unruly change ringing band. And we'll return to the behaviour of bell ringers a bit later. While that may be true in part, it's also the case that he was concerned that there weren't enough ringers in many places to sound out the bells. So his one-person apparatus was a solution to that problem. And if you want to see an Elocume apparatus, there is actually one in St. Botolph's Church in Cambridge at the foot of the tower, and that's now the only way that the 4 medieval bells there are heard.
Gareth, I'm only getting the these video clips now in top left quarter of my screen. I don't know whether everybody else is getting that. Not sure what's happened there.
So are you seeing the complete slide?
I'm seeing, yes, mouth down ringing with 4 quarters, and they are all within the top left quarter of my screen against the background of the National Gallery and Bell Square.
Okay, let me just, sorry about this. Let me just stop share and just try that again. Something's obviously gone slightly haywire there. I can make it bigger.
Yes.
How's that?
Yep.
That's good.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so apologies for that. nothing like the odd technical difficulty. So were you able to hear the Elohim? Let me just play it again. So, as I was saying, so they were invented by Henry Elohim, but is finally on this slide, although by no means exhausting the number of ways that bells can be rung, is swing chiming, a practice that happens in many places, including Hungary, where this video is recorded. And you'll see that there are two ropes pulling the bell to and fro from below until the bell is swinging far enough for it to start striking the clapper. Now, in this case, I don't know whether there are people below doing the pulling, but I suspect it's actually mechanized. And you'll hear one of the bell already ringing before the large ones start striking. Honestly. Sorry. Let's try that again. Never worked with children, animals, and technology. So the thing to note about all those examples is that the mouth of the bell starts by facing downwards. And in most, it remains static in that position as it's hit by the clapper or by a hammer. But even with swing chiming, the distance the bell moves is relatively small. And that's not a total surprise. Bells feature in many English illustrated manuscripts, and the bells are always shown as largely being mouthed down. Yet the defining feature of English change ringing is that the bells start in the position with the mouth up and that they swing through almost a complete 360-degree circle. So here are the bells of Great St Mary's in Cambridge, and you'll see that the bells are mouth up, and change ringing is sometimes described as full circle ringing, and you'll see that that's exactly what's going to happen. Each bell swings backwards and forwards with the clapper striking it once on each rotation, just as it reaches the highest point in the swing. And so on. So how did we get from the mouth down position of most bell ringing to the very unusual mouth up position of English change ringing? It's not quite unique, as there's something reasonably similar in parts of northern Italy. Well, this video of the bell being raised from the down position to the mouth up position shows how it's achieved. And it also gives us some clues about the technical and engineering changes that went into the development of the system we use today. So you'll see that the bell gradually swings higher and higher. And if you watch near the end, and you'll see that it's nearly rotating through 360 degrees, the ringer says, "Oh dear, he's pulled the bell slightly too hard," and it's only prevented from going round and round and round in the same direction by the wooden stay bouncing off the metal slider under the bell.
It's being swung, and you can't control how often the sound comes out. But as we go up, it's now striking on both sides of the bell, and the bell should now be about halfway up. You can see as it goes further up, more rope is vanishing. Oh dear. We're now on the point of balance. And the bell is now falling away from balance. And again on the point of balance, where I can let it go.
Now, if you were used to just swing chiming a bell, you can see how it would have been very tempting to see how high you could make it swing by pulling it harder and harder. And if we go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, it's clear that such ringing was popular as exercise and may even have been competitive. foreign visitors to England commented on the practice. A German lawyer, Paul Hentzner, wrote a diary of his travels during the latter part of Elizabeth I's reign, and he noted that, saying of the English, "They are powerful in the field, successful against their enemies, impatient of anything like slavery, vastly fond of great noises that fill the ear, such as the firing of cannon, drums, and the ringing of bells. So it is common for a number of them that have got a glass in their heads," and bell ringing and drinking goes together quite a lot, "to go up into some belfry and ring the bells for hours together for the sake of exercise." And then 20 years later, Orazio Bassino, the chaplain to the Venetian ambassador in London in 1617 and 1618, noted that the boys made bets who can make the parish bells be heard at the greatest distance. So that the bells could be swung higher and higher was down to developments in technology that seemed to have taken place towards the end of the 16th century. Swinging of the bell via ropes attached to levers, which we saw in the Hungarian video and in the illuminated manuscripts, had been replaced first with quarter wheels, then half wheels, like the ones at Little Melton in Norfolk, which still exist. But even half wheels only gave limited control over the swing of the bell. And it was the development of the full wheel and the stay and slider to hold the bell upside down, ready for full circle ringing, that completed the technical developments needed to make English change ringing possible. And that system, refined by the beginning of the 17th century, is pretty much still the one we use today. And it's at that point in the history of change ringing that the focus switches from engineering to mathematics. But before we launch into that aspect, let's just spend a few minutes thinking about the practicalities and difficulties of ringing a bell in this way, and about the limitations of church bells as musical instruments. Seen from the videos that the ringers are some way below the bells, with a significant length of rope between them and the wheel to which it's attached. There's a delay between the rope first being pulled and the bell beginning to turn, and a further delay as the bell turns almost through 360 degrees before the clapper actually strikes. Now, that doesn't matter too much if you're ringing a single bell, but imagine if you were playing a violin in an orchestra and there was a half second or a second delay between playing the note and actually hearing it. You'd constantly have to play ahead of the rest of the orchestra. But it's actually worse than that, because if you have several bells ringing and you want to sound them in a particular pattern, each bell is a different size and takes a longer or shorter period to swing. So the delay before one strikes is different for each bell. Large bells sound more slowly, small bells more quickly. And you also get a lot of variation introduced by the size of the wheels, the length and size of the clapper, whether it hangs absolutely central in the bell. If not, the bell can take longer to strike when rotating one way than the other, what ringers call odd struckness, and a whole host of other factors that result from variations in the way the bells and fittings are engineered. So in an orchestra, that would translate not just to the violin having to play early, but every other instrument having to play either early or late to make their sound match the timing of the overall piece. And I suspect if an orchestra tried it, the result would be not unlike the sound of the Portsmouth Symphonia, who some of you may remember from quite a while ago, which was a somewhat experimental approach to playing classical music. But church bells rung with rope and wheel are never going to play classical music. The limitations on the speeds at which they can be rung are too great. The bells can weigh as much as 4.5 tons, and they take some while to swing through 360 degrees. You can speed up the sound by stopping them from swinging quite as high, and you can slow them down by getting them to the balance point, upside down, and delaying the next pull. But the variations are relatively small. And it's those limitations that contributed and indeed governed the development of change ring. So, taking account of such limitations, let's imagine how the use of bells might have developed. Let's go back to the mid-16th century. There are 4 of us. We're all keen lads. I'm afraid ladies didn't start change ringing until the end of the 19th century. We're anxious to make a noise, maybe on the 4 bells at St. Botolph's. We'll take one bell each. What should we do? We don't yet have a mechanism to swing them full circle, so we'll chime them and possibly try to swing them as high as we can. So I know, let's swing each in turn. Who's going to start? Well, you start because you've got the smallest bell, and then we'll have the next heaviest and so on. And we end up ringing down the scale, assuming the bells are roughly in tune, and each bell strikes once down the scale. We won't miss anybody out. We won't ring twice until everybody else has had a go, and we'll keep repeating that. And what we've done is invented the first and most basic change, 1, 2, 3, 4, down the scale, known as rounds. And rounds is the start and finish point for all later changing. And we can get an idea of how that might have been done from this Italian video. You'll note that even allowing for the somewhat doubtful tuning of the bells, they're not actually ringing down the scale. In fact, they're repeatedly ringing what in England would be called the Queen's change, or Queen's, the pattern produced by ringing the odd numbered bells first and then the even bells. So on 4, it would be 1, 3, 2, 4. And it makes a distinctive pattern of descending thirds. It's often said it's named after Elizabeth I, but I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever to say that, and I'm afraid I haven't been able to ask her. Now, the other thing to note about that is those Italian ringers must have started by ringing that pattern of Queen's. The technology they're using doesn't really allow them to easily change the order while they're ringing. And this may explain why the earliest references to ringing in England include a system called set changes. It's not absolutely certain what this is, but it almost certainly means that the bells started in a particular pattern and then stopped and then started again in a different pattern. And we get a hint of that in a book by Holmbrandl published in Chester in 1688, which describes exactly that and calls it set changes. But the development of full wheels gave the ringers much more control over the bell. And within limits, an individual bell could be speeded or slowed up at will. And this made it possible to change the order of the bells without stopping and starting again. And now we begin to see the real start of change ringing. The first development appears to have been to ring what were called plain changes, where only one pair of bells changed order at a time. So starting with rounds, 1, 2, 3, 4 down the scale, there are a number of possibilities for changing. We could swap 1 and 2, in which case at the point of changing, the 1 or the treble would temporarily have to ring slightly slower, while the second speeded up to ring in front of it. And for the ringers, that would either mean holding the bell closer to the balance point to slow it down, or checking the rope to stop it swinging so high to speed it up. And all the while, I should say, trying to maintain an overall rhythm of equal spacing the sound of each bell. Or maybe 2 and 3 would swap, or 3 and 4. Note, though, that each bell only swapped with the one immediately before or after. Jumping a bell from one end of the change to the other, for instance, would have been quite physically difficult. And it quickly became a rule of most change ringing that bells only swapped with one of their immediate neighbours in the previous change. It's most likely that these plain changes were called by a conductor as the ringing proceeded. So he'd decide which pair to swap and call 1 follow 2, or 3 to 1, or 3 to 4. And from each new change produced, further calls could be made to swap new pairs of bells. And at some point, it became a convention that the ringing would start and finish with rounds. So some thought was needed by the caller to a pattern of swaps that would achieve that. And actually, this way of ringing is still practiced today, and it's known as call changes. And it's usually the first thing that learners attempt once they've mastered the basics of handling the rope and controlling the bell. However, in parts of the country, especially in Devon and Cornwall, it's become an art form in its own right. And there are fiercely contested competitions every year for the best call change bands. And when their ringing is good, it's very, very good. And you may get an idea from this clip how mesmeric the ringing can be as it rolls along fast and usually fault-free. And you may be able to hear the conductor calling out the numbers of the bells that are required to change places. So you get the idea. However, by the time the first two bell ringing handbooks came out, Tintinnalogia by Richard Duckworth in 1668 and Campanalogia by Fabian Stedman in 1677, plain changes have become rather old hat. Duckworth actually gave us a clue about the date when change ringing first began. He said, "It is admirable to conceive in how short a time it hath increased, that the very depth of its intricacy is found out. For within these 50 or 60 years last past, changes were not known or thought possible to ring." And that attribution to the first years of the 17th century pretty much accords with what's known about the development of the technology, but also with records of terms such as ringing the changes, which were coming into popular use. Duckworth then set out the instructions for ringing a pattern of plain changes on 5 bells that he called 20 all over. And you'll see that one pair of bells changes each time. First 1 and 2, then 1 and 3, 1 and 4, until the 1 or the treble is ringing last. When the treble is ringing last, the 2 starts its journey in the same way as the treble until it's the last bell, and is then followed by the 3 doing the same thing, and then the 4, and then the 5. And when the 5th has completed its journey, we're back to rounds again. It's a very simple system, but one that shows how quickly change ringing was developing as an exercise in pattern and order. In fact, this one was so simple that Duckworth only sets it down for antiquity's sake, he said. Though in former times it was much in use, it was rejected these days as being too simple, presumably. It does represent a move on from call changes, though, as probably all the ringers were expected to learn the pattern and ring it without each change being called. And that was possible because a change was made every time the bells rotated, rather than call changes where the same combination may be rung many times until the conductor decides to call a change. Clearly, it wasn't feasible for every ringer to make a decision about when to change. That would have caused huge confusion. So there had to be some prior agreement about what they were going to do. So plain changes were old hat by the 1670s, and Tintinnalogia and Campanalogia were mainly concerned with what were then newfangled cross-change methods that were being developed. It had fairly quickly been realized that it was possible to swap more than one pair of bells at the same time. So on 6 bells, for instance, you might swap all the pairs. 1, 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. But what to do next? If you swap them back again, you immediately return to rounds, and that's a bit boring. So one fairly simple thing to do was to reach a different change, was to only swap some of the bells the second time. So from 2, 1, 4, 3, 6, 5, we can get to 2, 4, 1, 6, 3, 5 by leaving the first and last bells where they are and swapping the 2 pairs in the middle, 1 and 4 and 6 and 3. And as I said, change ringing is all about patterns, and we've got the start of a pattern here. So we'll swap all the bells and then swap 2 pairs and repeat. And you'll see that after 6 changes, we've reached 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is the reverse of what we started with, and ringers called it back rounds. And if we carry on doing the same thing, we'll end up back where we started with rounds after 12 changes. Now, this is just about the simplest pattern that can be produced, though there are clearly lots of possible variations. We could have started by swapping the middle pairs, for example, and then done all of them. However, this particular pattern is called plain hunt minor, and I'll say a little bit more about the names in a minute. In the earliest ringing books, the methods like plain hunt minor are written out like this, though without the crosses, and how to learn and ring them is described in the text. So this is a method called Phoenix, which is rung on 5 bells. It was written out by Duckworth, and the listing on the right was known at the time as pricking the changes, and on the left is the rather wordy description of how to ring it. However, sometime in the 60 years after those books were published, someone realized there was an alternative way of describing and learning the methods. If you drew a line joining up the path followed by a single bell, you obtained a pattern. So let's take plain hunt minor, which is what we were looking at earlier, this time leaving out all the crosses. We'll then add a line to join up all the positions that the treble number 1 finds itself in. And if I now take away the numbers, we get this simple pattern. And if I can remember that pattern, then it helps me to ring the method. How, you ask? Let me put the numbers back. If you look closely, what you'll find is that when rounds are rung at the beginning, there are 5 bells that have to ring after the treble each time. The moment the treble starts moving its journey through the path of the other bells, every time it moves a step on, a bell jumps in front of it. So on its way to the end of the change, there are actually 6 bells it has to wait for before it rings again. And then when it's reached the back and is heading back down to the left, there are only 4 bells before it has to ring. So it's ringing more quickly in one direction, more slowly in another direction. So the blue line, and that's what the ringers call these patterns, even when it's not drawn in blue, confusingly, save you from having to remember all the numbers. And the rule is simple. If you're moving left to right along the line, away from the beginning of the change, you ring more slowly. If the line is vertical, you ring at a steady pace. And if you're moving along the line from right to left, you ring more quickly. It's simple. Simpler to say than to do. And we know that ringers were using this system from at least the early 18th century because Charles Mason, who was the professor of fossils at Cambridge University, made use of such diagrams in the ringing notebooks that he left and that are now in Downing College. And interestingly, he wrote the methods out horizontally rather than vertically, which is most ringers' preferred orientation. But you can see that the patterns here are rather more complex than the plain hunt we were looking at earlier. And he's also pricked the lines for several of the bells, not just for one. So one of the measures of progress in change ringing over the centuries and of the increasing skills of the ringers has been the increasing complexity of the methods being attempted. And in the 1770s, the ringers at Great St Mary's were close to the cutting edge of bell ringing achievement, and they successfully rang a peal of plain Bob Maximus, which is the method shown here. And this is the blue line of the method, ignore the red one, starting with what the heaviest bell does. And you'll see it's not dissimilar to the plain hunt. Lots of straight lines with only an occasional hiccup known as a dodge, where it takes a step back before continuing on its way, which means that the ringer has lots of continuous sections of ringing either more quickly or more slowly to settle into a rhythm. Compare that with this line of Bristol Surprise Maximus, which wasn't rung for the first time until 1950. You can see that the line is much more jagged with frequent changes of direction. And for the ringers, it means they're constantly having to adjust the speed of their bells. Slow, quick, slow, steady, and so on, making it much more difficult to maintain the constant rhythm of the entire piece. But such is progress. This method, which was regarded as nearly impossible to ring 70 years ago, is pretty much now a staple staple of the repertoire amongst those who regularly ring on 12 bells. And you'll almost certainly hear it being rung at Great St Mary's on a Monday night when the ringers there are practicing. So I've been using quite a bit of specialist terminology, and it might be worth spending a couple of minutes explaining what some of it means. At the very least, it might come in handy if you're doing a pub quiz. So let's start with the number of bells. Most churches at which change ringing is regarded as worthwhile have between 3 and 12 bells, though there are a few with more. Winchester Cathedral has 14. Strangely, there are 15 at Ossett in West Yorkshire, and St Martin's in the Bullring at Birmingham, the Swan Tower in Australia at Perth, and Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin each have 16. But by far the biggest number of towers have either 6 or 8 bells. And you'll see that generally above 5, towers invariably have an even number of bells. So Ossett really is an aberration. Though if I'd been giving this talk 5 years ago, there would have been one other odd bell tower, but All Saints Basingstoke had an extra bell added in 2016 after getting on with just 9 for over 100 years. Now, the lack of odd bell towers doesn't mean that methods are not rung on odd numbers of bells. Indeed, the most famous method of all, created and named after Fabian Stedman, is still very popular nearly 400 years after its invention. And Stedman, the method, works on any odd number of bells. However, when methods are rung on an odd number of bells at a tower which has an even number, the convention is that the heaviest bell, the tenor, doesn't ring the method, but simply rings last in every change. So in musical terms, that's as a kind of, I don't know, basso continuo, or it sets the rhythm, provides a regular beat, and acts as a counterpoint to the ever-changing pattern of the other bells. And here's an example of Stedman being rung on the 8 bells at Tadcaster in North Yorkshire. And if you listen carefully, you can probably hear the regular rhythm of the tenor bell ringing last each time. So, as the video indicated, when rung on 7 changing bells, that method's called Stedman triples. And triples is the name used for all 7 bell methods. The name reflects the fact that there are only 3 pairs of bells that can swap at the same time when ringing on 7. At least one has to stay in the same place each time, and that limitation sets the names for all odd bell methods. So only a single pair of bells can swap on 3, a double pair on 5 bells, a triple bell pair on 7, and then we get into a little bit of French. Quatre pairs or canters on 9 bells, and so on. Sextuples and septuples are much more recent inventions, but they follow the same principle. But all the other terms date back to at least the 17th or early 18th century. Unfortunately, there's nowhere near the same logic governing the terms associated with different even bell methods. Minor, major, royal, and maximus were all in use by the end of the 18th century, but minimus was a late 19th century invention, presumably based on reducing major, minor down to minimus, and 14 and 16 are late 20th century terminology, and I have to say show a disappointing lack of inventiveness. So if you look at the name of a method, it's in 3 parts. The last part, minimus, doubles, minor, triples, and so on, tells you how many bells it should be rung on. And then there's a bit in the middle, a word like plain, treble quart, treble bob, surprise, delight. And that relates to a group of methods. So methods that are all called surprise have something in common. I won't tell you what it is because I'm not sure I entirely understand it, and you have to be a A-level mathematician to even begin to think about it. But the bit at the beginning, which is the actual name of the method, is much more approachable. And the vast majority of method names relate to places, often ones where the method was rung for the first time, but not always. So we have Kent and Yorkshire and Cambridge. And we also have 6 Mile Bottom, for what it's worth. They might be named after events, coronations, ruby weddings, and so on. They might be named after things, birds, elements, sweets, or people, Stedman, groups of people like British scholars, and so on. And there are huge numbers of methods that have been rung. Probably, I couldn't find out how to count it, but it's in tens of thousands. And just occasionally, the naming conventions allow for a little bit of humour. So this at the bottom here is the blue line, although you'll notice it in red this time, for a method that is laughingly called on 11 bells, Titanic sinks. So as I say, there's an almost infinite variety of different methods. And the number increases as the number of bells increases. But what also increases is the number of different combinations that it's possible to ring. So the formula for working out the maximum number of different changes on a different number of bells was well known even in the 17th century. But it appears in one of Isaac Newton's notebooks from 1664, I think. You simply multiply 1 by 2 by 3 by 4 by 5 by 6, you get 720, and that's the maximum number of different changes. For ringers, the challenge was to work out ways of ringing them all without repeating any of them. For mathematicians, such as Saunderson, who was the Lucasian professor of maths at Cambridge University at the beginning of the 18th century, they provided a useful set of problems for his students. And as you can see, he reckoned reasonably accurately that ringing all 479,100,600 changes that are possible on 12 bells would only take 45 years of non-stop ringing. On the other hand, ringing the more modest 5,040 changes possible on 7 bells was rather more achievable, though it wasn't until 1715 that the Norwich ringers achieved it for the first time without repetition. And on the left, you can see the very fancy peal board that they erected at St. Peter Mancroft to celebrate the achievement, which had taken about 3 hours and 18 minutes. And after that, ringing at least 5,000 different combinations, different changes, became the standard for full peals, and bands competed to give the longest and best performances. And the board on the right sits in the ringing room at Great St. Mary's in Cambridge and records a peal of 6,600 changes on 12 bells that took them 5 hours and 5 minutes to complete in 1788. Indeed, the peal I showed you earlier of Plain Bob Maximus. So, having had a look at some of the arcane mysteries of change ringing, maybe we should have a quick look at some aspects of its history. I suppose if most people think about church bells today, they'll probably associate them first and foremost with some kind of church service, calling parishioners to Sunday worship or celebrating a wedding, maybe. First of those, you might be surprised to know, is a very recent development in the long history of change ringing. I haven't been able to find a single instance of change ringing calling people to an Anglican church service in Cambridge on a Sunday before 1929. Yes, bells were sounded, but it was invariably a single bell being chimed by the sexton or the parish clerk. And I specifically mentioned Anglican churches because ironically, and genuinely ironically, the one place where you could hear change ringing on a Sunday in Victoria's reign in Cambridge, at least after 1895, was at the Catholic Church of Our Lady in English Martyrs at the end of Regent Street. And we know they were rung there on Sundays after the church was opened because the congregation at the nearby Anglican Church of St. Paul's complained to the newspapers that the bells were drowning out the sound of their own service. Now, one of the reasons why people are surprised at the lack of Sunday ringing is that it was, and still largely is, believed that a 19th century belfry reform movement has succeeded in integrating ringing and ringers into the service of the church. I already mentioned the Reverend Henry Ellicombe, who was one of, if not the leading belfry reformer. And he and his colleagues, such as Walter Blunt, had a pretty poor opinion of change ringers in the middle of the 19th century. The most profane and profligate persons in the parish. Ringers are in many places a scandal to the church and a disgrace to themselves from the habits of drunkenness, Sabbath breaking, and other immoral conduct. I try to recognize myself in these descriptions sometimes. But in complaining about the lack of godliness of the ringers, the belfry reformers had conveniently forgotten, or didn't know, that for centuries the church had actively discouraged the association of bells with church ritual. After the Reformation, bells were far too closely associated with celebration of Catholic rituals, masses for the dead and so on, to find a comfortable place in a new Protestant church. But old habits died hard, and instead of bells ceasing, new secular associations were found for old religious traditions. So the widespread practice of ringing on the 17th of November for St. Hugh's Day, he was Bishop of Lincoln, so it's particularly true of the Lincoln diocese, was by happy coincidence of date gradually transformed into Elizabeth I's reign into ringing to celebrate the anniversary of the Queen's accession, which was also on the 17th of November. And that was a practice that continued on the anniversaries of subsequent monarchs until the middle of the 19th century. And even at the end of the 16th century, Puritans were still railing against the jangling of bells that is used in too many places. And that seems to have affected the Canterbury Convocation, because the revised Anglican laws of 1604 only required one bell in each church and quite restrained the times when it should be used. Secularization of bell ringing was confirmed under the Commonwealth when ringing was banned on Sundays, along with other activities that were regarded as inappropriate. Happily, though, the fact that change ringing had become a popular recreational activity and one divorced by then from religious meaning may well explain why the bells were rarely destroyed as part of the purge after 1643, as William Dowsing toured East Anglian churches, cleansing them of any monuments that might have been vaguely papist. And most of the bells were probably put in prior to the Reformation. And in fact, rather than the number of bells reducing during the 17th century, they continued to be cast and installed in ever greater numbers. And that's probably a testament to the growing interest in change ringing. But if there was no ringing for Sunday services, what about weddings? A couple of weeks ago, I rang for a wedding at Swaffham Prior. And as with many weddings, it was on a Saturday afternoon. We rang the bells, which were actually in the redundant church, but for the couple as they emerged from the neighbouring church of St. Mary, which doesn't have any bells. And apart from the use of both churches, that was a pretty typical practice. Ringing as the married couple left, and in some places they also ring as they arrive. Those practices are very different before the 20th century. I'm still doing some work on research on wedding ringing, but in Cambridge during the 18th and 19th centuries, the bells rang for weddings, just not usually in the church where it was actually held, or indeed immediately before, during, or after the service. Ringing at the time was a mark of a couple's change in social status. It marked their marriage, not part of the wedding ceremony itself. Anyone of sufficient status could have the bells rung for their marriage by arranging it with the ringers at Great St. Mary's. But it would be at Great St. Mary's that the bells would ring, irrespective of where the ceremony was being held. And quite a lot of the ones that they rang for weren't even held in Cambridge. I think the furthest afield was when they rang for one which was held in Brussels. And the other thing was that the ringing always took place at 6 o'clock in the morning on the day of the wedding. It was very unusual for the ringing to take place on a Saturday because most people didn't get married on Saturdays. And indeed, you can see from the graph that the most popular days when the ringing took place for marriages was actually a Tuesday or a Thursday. But what all the couples had in common was that they had enough money to pay the ringers. And generally speaking, before the 20th century, the ringers expected payment for anything they did that wasn't their own recreational ringing. And the range of ringing things they rang for were rather different to what we might expect today. So this is a breakdown of paid events for which the Cambridge youths based at Great St Mary's rang between 1724 and 1913. Now you can see that marriages were actually both the most frequent and the most lucrative ringing that the ringers did over time. But there were also a wide range of university occasions, both for the university as a whole and for individual members. So if you were promoted to a fellow or a professor or a master of a college, you'd probably get the bells rung. If you were a fellow who found himself appointed to a vicarage, or you became a dean or a bishop, then you'd probably also get the bells rung. Royal milestones were marked: accessions, coronations, marriages, and deaths. Those were usually paid for by the parish. And until about 1850, they were paid in beer rather than cash. So if clergymen were worried about the drunkenness of their ringers, part of the blame lay with their churchwardens. And bells were a regular and frequent accompaniment to parliamentary elections, especially on nomination day and when the successful candidates were chaired around the town. Town corporations celebrated the annual election of the mayor, and aldermen and common councilmen paid the ringers to ring for their election as well. The bells rang on evenings that the judges arrived to preside over the twice yearly assize courts. Ringing for death and funerals was rather different. The only people entitled to have muffled bells rung for them were the crowned heads and members of the ringing society. And the only exception that they made before the late 19th century was on the day of Nelson's funeral. And even more remarkably at the time, they rang for Nelson but didn't seek payment for it. And then there are a whole host of other events and personal triumphs that might lead to the bell ringers being commissioned. They were paid to ring for lottery wins. They were paid to ring for successes in court cases. When the agricultural show was held in Cambridge at the end of the 19th century, the agricultural show organisers had the bells rung. Ringing for success in battle rang through the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, though often usually well after the actual battle had completed, such was how long it took for the communication to get there. But in total, these sums that the ringers earned amounted to somewhere over £8 million at today's prices. So this was not just a hobby. For some of the ringers, it was also a second business. Now, unfortunately for me and other ringers, most of those have long since disappeared, and really weddings are the only time we get paid these days. So finally, just a brief mention of ringing during the pandemic. Only in the last few weeks have we begun to hear church bells ringing again. It's not the first time they've been silent. Most of the bells stopped for a while during plague outbreaks in Cambridge in the 1660s, and all bells were silent for parts of the Second World War. Ringers at those times didn't have access to modern technology, but it's amazing what human ingenuity can come up with. So online systems such as Ringing Room, which is on the screen, have kept bands of ringers together and made it possible for us to practice at least some of our skills online, even if pushing keyboard buttons is not quite the same as pulling a rope. But it's also allowed us to visit towers that have no change ringing bells. So here's a tower, Ely Cathedral, where you can't go and ring the real bells. Ringing's not quite back to normal yet, but hopefully it soon will be. And I hope you'll be able to enjoy listening to their sound with a little more understanding of their complexity and history. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to try and answer any questions, but let me leave you with some ringing from the really rather magnificent bells of Our Lady and English Martyrs in Cambridge. And this band are ringing Grancer triples, the same method rung by the Norwich ringers to the first full peal in 1715. And it's a reminder of the very long and continuous history of change ringing that still links the people who do it today to the people who were doing it nearly 400 years ago. As it's triples, and you'll know that's on 7, you'll be able to hear the 3100 weight tenor ringing last in every change. If you want to work out who it is, it's the ringer nearest to the camera on the right. This is the very end of the ringing, so you'll hear the conductor say, "That's all," which is what I'm saying to you in terms of my talk. And as it comes back into rounds, you'll hear him also say, "Stand," the instruction to set the bells. So here is a bit of that ringing. Thank you very much.
So do we have any questions? I can't see any in chat at the moment.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
You mentioned Duckworth explaining how much progress had been made in the 17th century, and he was undoubtedly right. There's all sorts of evidence for that. But as you also pointed out, that during the Commonwealth, bells were a bit frowned upon. We also had this hiccup of the Civil War. I would have thought this was a most unpropitious time for any sort of advance in anything. How do you reconcile these difficulties?
Yes, the Civil War period is quite interesting in a way, because ringing doesn't seem to have stopped. It clearly slowed down a bit, but actually the ringers found lots of opportunities to ring. So actually in Cambridge, if you were a ringer at Holy Trinity Church, you actually supported the Roundheads, and the bells were rung several times for Roundhead victories. If you rang at King's College, because King's College used to have a ring of bells as well, you were royalist, and the bells there rang frequently for the king. So there were quite a lot of opportunities to ring. What seems to have reduced, though, is that churches didn't spend so much time on maintaining their bells. So when Charles II came back to the throne, there was a sudden burst of expenditure on making sure that the bells were in working order.
Very nice.
Yes, thank you.
We know, incidentally, Frank, that they were change ringing in Cambridge well before 1640 as well.
Oh, we certainly do, yes.
Yeah,
And it's even sort of evidence of a proto-Cambridge use in 1669.
Yeah. There are records of university students ringing in 1631.
But what I was particularly worried about is that, I mean, Cromwell was well known, or at least in the Puritan Revolution post-Civil War, the destruction of stained glass windows and anything which might faintly have had something to do with a saint, indeed anything which had any taint of Roman Catholicism. And as you also pointed out, bells were linked with papist type activity. I'm surprised he didn't simply melt bells down left, right and centre and turn them into weapons.
I think it's difficult to be sure what the answer to that is, but I think what had happened was that the bells were so popular by then in a non-religious context, and change ringing itself was becoming quite well known as an activity that people took part in, that actually people might put up with having their icons broken, but they would have really objected to having the bells broken. And you have to bear in mind that the bells served more than just a religious purpose. They actually served a civic function as well. Much of the ringing that they carried out was nothing to do with the religious side of the church. A lot of it was to do with the management of parishes and what the parish was doing.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
We don't seem to have any other questions in chat. Would anybody else like to put a question orally to Gareth?
David Pritchard.
Ah, yes. Can you unmute yourself, David?
Yes, Gareth, thank you for your fascinating overview of bell ringing down the centuries. And I was interested that 6 Mile Bottom came to have its own name in there. Can you explain the background to that?
Yes, I mean, 6 Mile Bottom doesn't have its own bells. So I'm afraid bell ringing is often carried out by young people as well as old. And when they're young, they tend to push the boundaries of propriety a little bit sometimes. So there are a number of methods where people have scoured the country for slightly dubious names to attach to methods. So there is, for example, a small village, I think of 2 houses in Scotland, which is called Boghole. And there is a method called Boghole something or other. I can't remember what the rest of it is. So I'm afraid it was probably a little bit of a joke. But the method, unfortunately, now is saddled with the name 6 Mile Bottom.
Can I ask a supplementary to that? When I was a vicar in Oxfordshire, I was vicar of a church where the ring was anti-clockwise.
Yeah.
And it was a timber-framed bell frame, which Whites of Appleton obviously modernised. And interestingly enough, the ringers were so wedded to and the anti-clockwise ring that the new bells in a new frame were rung in the hung anti-clockwise. So it was an unusual tower in that respect. But how many towers across the country have the anti-clockwise ring rather than the normal clockwise?
So a decreasing number, unfortunately, because I think the temptation is when people have their bells rehung is to reverse them and put them into the clockwise order, where the heavier bells are to the left rather than to the right. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, though I could find out fairly quickly. But the number's decreasing. I mean, for example, the 12 bells at Great St Mary's were anti-clockwise until the 1950s. There was a rehanging in 1951, I think it was, certainly 51, 52, sometime around there. And they took the opportunity to hang them clockwise rather than anti-clockwise. If you go to Southwell Minster, they're an anti-clockwise ring of 12, and they're still anti-clockwise. And there are some around, but compared to the ones that hung clockwise, it's a tiny proportion. I don't think there's any particular benefit to them being one way around or the other. It's just most people have got used to them being clockwise. Well, there may have been some towers where, in order to fit the frame in, they needed the pits for the bells to be in a particular order, and that may have driven it. But,
I have one.
Yes, do yes.
Gareth, can you tell us something about the nature of people who ring now that you're all entirely sober?
Yes, they're everybody from 8-year-olds to 90-year-olds, and indeed 100-year-olds, actually. They're probably just about an equal number of men and women. You don't require particular strength to do it. It's more about technique than strength. I don't know whether anybody spotted, but in that clip of the bells at the Catholic Church in Cambridge ringing at the end, the ringer of the 7th was a quite small girl, and that bell weighs more than a ton, and she was stroking it around very, very easily without too much effort. So I think the answer is that ringers nowadays are a complete cross-section of the population in terms of the kinds of jobs they do, and their gender and age and a whole range of things. I think it's fair to say that ringing is an aging population at the moment. There are concerns about how you attract young people to it. That's probably in common with many other types of activity as well. But it is rather addictive. So I suppose the thing that all ringers have in common is we all have an addictive personality.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, if there are...
Hello, can I just come in here? It's John Mitchell, Bellringer from Ely.
Hello,
Thank you, Gareth, for a fascinating talk. According to Dove, there are 173 anti-clockwise rings which are ringable.
Thank you very much.
And there's another 120 unringable.
Brilliant.
So 293 in total.
Yes, out of a total of about 9,000 rings of bells across the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for acting as my amanuensis there. That's very helpful.
Pleased to help. Yeah.
Another question from David Pritchard, I think.
Well, it's fascinating. I'm just wondering how bells over the generations have been used in relation to bits of the church's liturgy. And the reason I question that is that I served in a parish in the Thames Valley, which had basically a carillon type ring of 3 bells, and they were just ropes pulled at the back. And one of the musicians in the church created a carol, and it was called the local bell carol, and it was and it came out every year, and it was very popular. I just
Right.
wonder, are there many other instances of liturgical use of bells in that way that you've come across?
So in Anglo-Catholic churches now, a bell is often rung during communion.
Yeah.
In terms of music, I suppose is what we're talking about, then there's a long history of the kinds of patterns you get in change ringing finding their way into more mainstream music, and that goes right back to the 17th century. Not necessarily, though, associated particularly with the church's liturgy. There's a 17th century composer called John Jenkins, who composed a number of orchestral pieces, which not only draw on bell ringing patterns, but are actually named after things like bell ringing itself. So, and that's continued. I mean, there are pieces by Arvo Part now which are based on bell ringing themes as well, and there probably are some more bell ringing carols. There are certainly bell ringing hymns that ringers sing at services and so on. But I hadn't heard about that one in particular, so that's quite interesting. One of the things that I did spend a little bit of time looking for is trying to work out whether there was a correlation between bells starting to appear in the words of hymns with the mid-19th century belfry reform movement. Haven't pinned that down yet, but there are certainly no references to bells in the very earliest hymns that were published.
Well, if there are no other questions, it only remains for me to thank you, Gareth, for an absolutely fascinating talk, which for me was really an introduction to a subject I had on which I was very, very ill-informed to start, and I think brilliantly put the historical line of development and the way that the mathematics were followed in the course of that development. You've made that thoroughly comprehensible. Well, I can't say I've remembered every detail, but since this lecture is recorded, I shall certainly revisit it and try to master it more completely. But no, we are much indebted to you, Gareth, for that splendid exposition of the subject. Those of you who are not members of our trust, we'd be delighted if you joined, and if, as I'm sure you have, you've enjoyed this evening, those of you who don't really want to join, please do make a donation to trust funds, because I've explained how badly needed our help is for churches in our county. But anyway, thank you very much again, Gareth. That was an absolutely splendid performance. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. And if you live near a church with bells, please do go up and see what they do, what they're doing when they're ringing again after COVID. Bell ringers are usually quite friendly and very happy to take you to the pub.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye.